This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. How should we remember the past, even if our history is painful at times? A former teacher in Guilford, Connecticut, helped start a project to remember enslaved residents in his town. It's called the Witness Stones Project. It was inspired by the stumbling stones that started in Germany, placed to memorialize where Jewish people lived before being killed in the Holocaust. In Connecticut, the Witness Stones Project has grown, and now more than 70 stones have been placed to remember enslaved Africans and Native Americans who lived in our towns. Coming up, we hear how members in one community are researching the past of an enslaved woman named Tamer. First, joining us on Zoom is Dennis Culleton, co-founder and executive director of the Witness Stones Project. Dennis, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Lucy.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Dennis, you were back on the show in 2018, and that was after you started the project in Guilford. And back then you told me your goal was to place 30 stones in town. So how many are in Guilford now? And describe these markers for us.
Yes, there are 7 stones in Guilford right now, and they're placed mostly around the green in Guilford. We have this beautiful 8-acre green. And when we started with a local committee, we thought that this would be a great way for us to understand who lived in our communities. We have these wonderful house plaques that show us who owned the houses, and they're all of white people who own the houses. And we also, most of the time it's men, although there's occasionally one for women. But we thought, there's other people who live here, and how can we remember them and remember their stories? So my friend Doug Nygren came back from Germany with the idea of the Stolperstein, using my research. And then, of course, we brought it to the classroom. We are planning on putting 3 stones in North Guilford on the 1st of June. And that's going to be the first time we're putting stones outside of the downtown community.
Now, I understand that there are 72 stones around Connecticut. So tell me about how this project has grown. Who are involved in researching and thinking about the people that lived in their communities?
Well, I'm going to give you some credit because after the radio show in 2018, I was contacted immediately by retired teachers in West Hartford, Tracy Wilson and Liz Devine and Denise Melillo. And they contacted me and they said, could we bring the Witness Stones Project here? So I was able to get a grant from Connecticut Humanities to give a workshop for those teachers. And they started to do the work in West Hartford. And they have dozens of stones that they've placed at the old burial ground there. And also as a spinoff of the radio program, Jennifer Frank, a writer who was a co-writer of the book Complicity, wrote an article about the Witness Stones Project for the Southern Poverty Law Center magazine, Teaching Tolerance, and it went to about 40,000 teachers across the country. So that was really a big part of our jumpstart. But what we've been doing since is giving teacher workshops across the state to help them understand what Connecticut's economy looked like, during the colonial and early American periods, what slavery looked like in Connecticut, then using local research, oftentimes done by people in Greenwich or Old Lyme or West Hartford, applying that research to tell the story of enslaved individuals. I also do a lot of the research myself, and I'll go into communities and look in the wills and archives and property records and other places to pull out records about these individuals.
Well, I loved hearing that anecdote that the project really blossomed when you talked about it on Where We Live. Thank you, Dennis, for sharing that.
Sure.
And I love hearing that not only do you have former or current history teachers and historians, but there are community members that have gotten involved and so many students. Can you talk about the work with them?
Yes, I think the biggest surprise to me was during this COVID year that many teachers, of course, after the sad deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and many others, realized that they had to do something in their classroom. So they wanted to bring something that was meaningful, that talked about issues of social justice and race and inequality. And so they approached me. So oftentimes I'm approached by teachers and sometimes by, like you said, community members and sometimes by historical societies. But the most important part is that we bring it to the community, and we probably reached over 4,000 students at this time in these few short years. and we do it through individual projects in these towns. But I'm very excited with the partnerships, and we are opening a Witness Stone Center at Central Connecticut State University this summer, and we're now expanded to also New Jersey and Massachusetts, with discussions in Rhode Island and other places. So it's a crazy time for us.
Again, you're hearing Dennis Culleton here on Where We Live, co-founder and executive director of the Witness Stones Project, as we learn about why communities are thinking about the residents who were formerly enslaved in their towns. When we think about history, the people that we learn about, but those stories that have been hidden from us and the reasons why. Again, you can join us if you have a question about the Witness Stones Project, if you're interested in bringing this to your community, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Dennis, you mentioned Complicity, and that was such a groundbreaking book about Connecticut's history with slavery. So there are people in communities that are engaged with that history, but what are the reactions from whether it's residents or students who didn't understand Connecticut's role with slavery?
Yeah, I think, it's very interesting, because I think with students, the reaction is, wow, this is neat, good, this is good stuff. This is neat stuff. We can begin to, examine why we have the Black Lives Matter movement today. We could look 300 years ago in Connecticut and see how African Americans were treated. But I think, there's such a, with adults, sometimes there's a teeny bit of cognizant dissonance, because we're trying to teach them things that they learn differently. So imagine going to somebody and saying, well, your 8th grade history teacher told you a story that isn't complete, or told you a story that's partially wrong about American history. And we're going to share with you the documents, the details, the facts that show us that there was a different history, that Connecticut made a large percent of its money from trading with slave owners in the South and in the West Indies. And that's why we have these big houses around our greens and stuff. It isn't because we were selling hay to each other. And that isn't something that everybody wants to hear. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I learned that slavery was a Southern issue, racism was a Southern issue, inequality was a Southern issue, and segregation was a Southern issue. And it was shocking to me to realize that slavery was here, racism was in our laws, segregation is something that we have walls to keep people out of our communities, and inequality is here every day. So but then what happens if you know this information? Then we can't say the South has to fix things. We kind of have to say we have to fix things. So we don't the Witness Stones Project doesn't have to go too deeply in that when we're in the classroom, but we have to show the students what happened here, and we do it through telling individual stories.
To give people an idea, between the early 1700s and early 1800s, when we think about slavery as a part of Connecticut's history, there were more than 5,000 enslaved people that lived in our state. That's according to West Hartford town historian Tracy Wilson. So when people hear those numbers, I imagine they're surprised, Dennis.
Yes, and I think they're more surprised. I'm looking at a map on my wall taken from this old magazine that shows the map of Connecticut according to the 1790 census. And there is not a community in Connecticut in 1790 that did not have enslaved people. I think that's a shock, too, because we can always say, oh, there were enslaved people. They were probably in New London, or they were probably in Bridgeport, or they were probably in New Haven. Well, they were probably in your town too. And that's the part that's shocking to people, because once we localize it or hyper localize this, then we begin to think differently and hopefully internalize a different view of the past. We like to say we're weaving colors back into the fabric of our history, where we're telling these stories and really trying to tell a story of slavery, but also of agency and resistance, and about how these enslaved people, even though they were dehumanized, show their humanity. And we spend a lot of time fleshing that out, because the documents don't necessarily tell us that. If you enslave somebody, you want to diminish them in your documentation so that your reasoning for enslaving them is logical. But if you realize that they're humans, you can read across the grave and find evidence of their humanity.
If you want to get a look at what a witness stone looks like in these communities, if you go to WNPR.org/where-we-live, there are pictures that Dennis Culleton has shared with us of markers that have been put up in different communities. And again, you can join us 888-720-9677 as we talk more about the Witness Stones Project. Cheryl in New Haven. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much. I just wanted to share, I was lucky enough to see Dennis present to the Connecticut Society of Genealogists, and as a result reached out, and he gave me the opportunity to volunteer. As a genealogist, we do a lot of volunteer work and a lot of research, and I am so happy that I have this opportunity. It's not easy research. It can be really hard and challenging when you uncover certain facts and information and even where you find it. But it's so important, and I just wanted to share that I love the opportunity, Dennis, that you've given me. And I'm still working on it. In fact, I'm working on it today, and very happy that all the archives are beginning to open up so that I have access to more records. But being in New Haven, he's having me do research in New Haven, and I hope that the research that I do can help schools, and I encourage New Haven schools to reach out to Dennis and the Witness Stones Project to start partnering with him.
Thank you, Cheryl. Dennis, did you want to respond?
Yes, Cheryl, thank you so much. And I appreciate the work we're doing. We are doing an installation ceremony on June 2nd at the Party Morris House with students from Cold Spring School and Foot School. So, we're so excited to be, to have a toehold, I would say, in New Haven. But there's, as Cheryl could tell you, there's so many stories to tell, and they're so interesting because these are stories that haven't been told, and you stumble across these lives of people that are amazing, that we, are lost to history, except with the help of people like Cheryl and other historians and our students who take these documents and tell us, put these stories together and share them with the community.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest, Dennis Culleton, will stay with us as we learn more about how other Connecticut towns are exploring their connections to slavery. There are efforts to place a witness stone in my town of Suffield. Coming up, a local historian will talk about the work being done to remember an enslaved woman named Tamer. And we want to hear from one of her family's descendants as well. Now, do you have a witness stone where you live? We want to hear from you. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Now, I've lived in Suffield for nearly 6 years, and it's a town that is proud of its history. Suffield's Main Street is a historic district listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and many of the historic homes bear markers with the names of prominent residents who lived or built those homes. But there are now efforts to place a marker, a witness stone, to remember a woman named Tamer, who was enslaved and lived in Suffield in the late 1700s. Joining us now is the person who's been leading the research efforts with a group of Suffield residents. Bill Sullivan joins us on Zoom. He's a Suffield Historical Society trustee, also an English and history teacher at Suffield Academy. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Lucy.
So I love these history stories, and we do a lot of history shows. But as a historian, tell us how this all got started in Suffield.
It began about 10 years ago. I have a senior seminar class where I cast a driving question to them, and they put on a presentation to the Historical Society. And it's great. And usually there's always an African-American topic. And 3 years ago, it was the driving question was about women's history, to get the town to do some history, original history for our town's 350th birthday party. And some students were holding this bill of sale and looking at it carefully, and they realized that, well, wait a minute, Luther Loomis sold Tamer to Solomon Smith of Haddam. And they just read the complicity chapter on Venture Smith, and they're like, is this Solomon Smith vis-a-vis Venture Smith's son? And we contacted Dr. Carl Stovkoff, who's the family historian genealogist for the Venture Smith descendants. And we wrote him a letter, old-fashioned snail mail letter, and he wrote a wonderful letter back, and indeed it was. And that's where the town collective history began on that. And then, as Dennis was saying, during COVID last spring, he and I were working on other projects here, and I realized, wait a minute, we should plan an asynchronous online learning class for the Historical Society. And we launched it on the Historical Society Facebook page, and it started with 20 students, and it took off to over 40 now. We were planning 3 classes, but then these are great students. They found all these wonderful documents that open up 2 more chapters to Tamer's life, where the Venture Smith historians thought Tamer passed away in 1810, but we found 2 more decades of her life. So it's been exciting.
Now, you've mentioned Venture Smith a couple of times, and I think some of our listeners know about him, but he was a freed Black man who wrote his own autobiography, one of the, I think, first known accounts by a formerly enslaved person, writing about his life. And tell us about Tamer and how she fits into his family story.
Yes, it is good to pause on Venture Smith. I mean, it's an amazing document, an amazing narrative. It shows all the dehumanization that enslaved people had to endure, and there's some rough times in his life. But interesting too, in the document, you learn that he was a prince in Africa when he was kidnapped, and with that, I think the students, as Dennis was saying, they're open to new stories, and with that, when we found the discovery that Tamer was connected to Venture Smith's family, we went back and looked at the documents carefully. And what we found is that we don't know where Tamer was born. And that's an unfortunate, sad story when you do African-American research. But when she was 7 years old, she was sold from Comfort Smith here in Suffield to Luther Loomis. That's where we then began making more connections to try to figure out the history of Luther Loomis and what her life was like. And then the class took off from there.
And through your research and your class research, you learned that Tamer lived in Suffield for about 18 years?
Yes.
I'd love to know more about the documents, and this is something that Dennis Culleton brought up earlier, because as historians, in a way, you're also detectives, right? And you're finding different pieces of information. And the point that Dennis brought up earlier, in the sense of someone who enslaved others, they didn't make a point to distinguish this person's humanity, or even to list them as if they were a person. And so, talk through those documents that your class went through.
Correct. That's a good point. And that's where I should say, taking a step back, that Dennis was great. And we had a conference this summer with other Connecticut teachers, and we called it the Hard History Conference. And with that, we had Dr. Hassan Jeffries, who's out of Ohio State, who helps teachers with the hard history of doing this type of history, so that you can, one, feel comfortable talking about race back then as well as today. And the other good thing too, on Dennis's website, you can see these 5 themes of research that you keep in mind when you do this research are very helpful. So looking at the dehumanization aspect of these documents, it is quite telling, and that's where you have to look sideways. Once you find the document, you just have to start cross-referencing and find out what other enslaved women did in a colonial household. And then when you see the size of Luther Loomis's household, you realize what she was most likely doing around the fire, around childcare, and other duties. And
one of the members of your research class, also part of the Suffield Historical Society, is Jackie Heemond, who used to be the librarian in town. Jackie, welcome to the show. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Jackie, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thank you for joining the show today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to join you.
So we were just talking about the documents that the class discovered and how you research a person like Tamer. And I'm wondering if you can walk us through how, when you were the librarian, how you were helping his students find more information on Tamer and how the Historical Society group has taken it further.
Well, what happened, this came to my attention when Bill came maybe 4 years ago, Bill, to find the bill of sale for Tamer. And at the time, the library was under renovation and our archives were off-site. So he had to search for the bill of sale and found it, and that started the journey. So that was very exciting. I only pointed, Bill did the research. And the same thing was with the class. I was an eager participant, but did not do the research that the other class, my other classmates did. But it was very exciting to participate in that and to find out more information about Tamer. And it's exciting because when I went to school, this type of history was not talked about. So it's a great thing.
Bill, we're getting a question on Twitter. I think Allie wants to know, how do you find these bills of sale?
Well, I should say, we have, we're very fortunate here in Suffield that we have an amazing 19th century historian, Hezekiah Spencer Sheldon, who's documented histories of Suffield point out slavery and point out specific moments when and where it happened with the colonial ministers. And it's interesting. So once you do a local deep dive, then you can start seeing how other communities do a deep dive. And that's the fun part about, working with Dennis. It's almost like I feel I'm at a graduate seminar with him. And I can take what I learned and then cross-reference what he and other historians and local communities have found. And it's really, that's how we can put together sort of in a quilt fashion, a better history of 18th century enslaved lives in early 19th century here in Connecticut. But you find it all sorts of different ways. Some people will write about it, or actually another aspect is oftentimes enslavers didn't really describe the people they enslaved until they ran away. And that's a significant moment where you can learn more about the institution of colonial Northern slavery. But so, yeah, your local archivist will help. I didn't necessarily discover this bill of sale. It's been curated in our library before. Ann Borg of the Historical Society knows that room inside and out and can show you 3 different ways to find something. And like I said, also the 1920s historic commemoration committee here in Suffield documented slavery as well. So what's so fascinating and fun, and it's just a great challenge, whether adult students or high school students, is that this research takes sideways thinking, cross-referencing, and particularly that's a skill that young learners don't know because Google now has taken away cross-referencing. And so I love teaching that. And when they get into this, where, as Dennis was saying too, these are important stories. When they get into the story, then they're ready and open to learning any new type of research skill.
Dennis Culleton, you're still with us, again, co-founder of the Witness Stones Project. You were a former teacher. Bill laid out that Suffield has many great resources and people so engaged with the town history. But if you live in a town that doesn't have that kind of resource or people that have done all of this archival work, where do you begin?
I think you use the term detective work and you find a thread. And so it might be in an anecdote. It might be in the church archives. There's at the state library. Most of the congregational churches and some of the Episcopal churches in the state have their books indexed. So you go to the back of the book where it says people without surnames, and you start looking at names, and you might find someone like Pompey, and it might say Pompey, servant of Elijah Dodd, baptized, 1750. Then you say, who's this Elijah Dodd? And then you try to find documents about him in his will. In his will, he might mention Pompey again and who Pompey is given to. You might find someone later on in the census on the same street that Eli Dodd lived, or Elijah Dodd, a man named Pompey Negro, and then you keep going from there. So you take census data, probate records, probate inventories, wills. Enslaved people were oftentimes freed, as in the property records, very close to where you would find deeds and home sales. And you just keep pulling it's like you pull the strings together, kind of what Bill was saying, and you take these patches and you make a quilt with them. And some individuals, you might find a dozen documents that help tell a very thorough and rich story, and other individuals, you might just find a birth or death record or a baptismal record. But every town in Connecticut that was around during the colonial period has these records either in the probate court or the property vault or the state library. And our friends at Ancestry.com have digitized a lot of the stuff. So it makes it, so during COVID, you could, as I did this winter, you could sit at your computer and find wills for many of the people that who were the enslavers, which helps us. And occasionally we find wills for free Blacks that help us understand what their life was like in their wills and their probate inventories, what property they owned, what type of work they did, and whether they played the violin. So I would just say there's not a straight shot to how to do this, but you just take that thread or that patch and you start sewing another patch to it, and before you know it, you can tell a story.
Those are good tips for us. Jackie Hemond, I did want to ask you, I heard the excitement when you were talking about being involved in this project. Anything that you learned that surprised you about Tamer?
Well, what I thought was very interesting, I wanted to point out the documents that we found with Tamer. And first thing we found is that she was married to Solomon in a white church in Hartford. So that was one document that was found. Another document talking about Luther Loomis, who was her master in Suffield, was involved in the West Indian slave trade. And so there was newspaper reports about his ship traveling back and forth to that area. Another document that was found was that Solomon had posted that she had run away from him in 1810, I believe. And then the last document that was found was a record that she had died, and that there was a nurse had sent a bill of invoice for her funeral expenses, or her nursing expenses, I guess it was. So that was also exciting, and it came in piecemeal throughout the class. Very exciting.
Well, thank you, Jackie, for calling in to talk about why you're involved still in this research project in the town of Suffield. Thanks, Jackie, for your time today.
Okay.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about the Witness Stones Project through the work of co-founder Dennis Culleton. Some Connecticut towns are confronting their connections with slavery and have put up markers, witness stones, to remember enslaved residents. Now, there's an effort happening in Suffield where I live. We just also heard from Bill Sullivan, a trustee of the Suffield Historical Society, who has led a study group of interested community members like Jackie to research the life of an enslaved woman who lived in Suffield in the late 1700s. Her name was Tamer. Now, she married Solomon Smith, as we heard, after he purchased her in 1798. He was the son of Venture Smith. And joining us now on Zoom is a ninth descendant of Venture Smith, Susi Ryan. She's a fiber artist and speaker. She documents and cloths her enslaved ancestors and other people in the African diaspora. Susi, welcome to our show.
Good morning. Thank you, Lucy, for having me on today.
I love hearing about your family history. And could you tell us more about what you learned in your relation to Venture Smith?
So my family has been blessed, and I say it blessed in the sense that other people have been documenting Venture's story since his first narrative came out. And so as an African American and descendant of slaves on both sides of my paternal family, I feel blessed that, in our family that we have this documentation where so many people descendant of slaves in the United States have nothing to go on. So every time that someone does research and finds something, whether it's on Venture's side of the family or, other African Americans within the diaspora, it's just, to me, it's like a form of reparation, because for so long, many people, the slave masters and the descendants of the slave masters, didn't want to volunteer that information up easily. So again, as a descendant, I'm blessed, but I'm also grateful for the people that have been doing the research all along, trying to, put the stories together.
I understand these story quilts that you make. Tell us about how you tell the story of your family and others.
So I'll give you an example of one particular quilt that I made. Growing up in Connecticut, my family, my grandfather's side of the family, which is the Venture Smith side, they love to fish, and my grandfather was an avid fisher, as was my father and my uncle, and so we would have family picnics and go fishing and swimming and picnicking in Stonington, Connecticut. And it wasn't until 2009 that Marta Daniels and her partner, Nancy Byrne, discovered that the 26 acres that Venture, the first documented piece of land that Venture had purchased, was exactly where we were going fishing and taking the boat over to Fisher's Island. So,
wow.
So one of my pieces is a tribute to that actual 26 acres. It's a map quilt, and I've actually made two of them. One of them I actually gave to Marta Daniels. It's a representation of the 26 acres and how they were hidden in plain sight for over 200 years. And the property is directly close to Thomas Stanton, who was Venture Smith's former master. And because of a rock, glacial erratic, that was the marking that people were saying that the land was a pie-shaped piece of property. In reality, it was more like a wonky diamond piece of property. And so I made the first piece in calico cloth because Venture was sold for 4 barrels of rum and a piece of calico. And then I made a second one after my family had gone to Ghana to retrace Venture's footsteps through Fort Anamabu. And so I had a lot of African cloth, and I made a second one in African cloth, and as a tribute to Venture himself.
We've been learning today about the Witness Stones project, these efforts by local residents to memorialize enslaved residents like Tamer. When did you learn about the Witness Stones project, and what do you think about Tamer's story?
Oh, I found out about the Witness Stone project earlier this year from Laurie, who was with Bill. I believe she was a student in one of his classes. And she had sent an email to my sister and I asking if we would be interested in learning more about this news that was discovered. And I've known about Tamer as far as that she was Venture's, Solomon's wife. But I think it's amazing that people are actually honoring part of American history, which I always say African American history is American history. So to be part of this, it's another honor, and I'm going to put my hands right into the sink and help do more research for other people, because again, my family is blessed, but there's so many out there that don't have this. So if people can find researchers and scholars and descendants, and myself, a descendant, trying to help other descendants piecemeal their family together, then I feel that's a wonderful project.
Well, it's been really nice to hear from you, Susi Ryan, again, a fiber artist and a speaker, a ninth descendant of Venture Smith, Venture Smith was a freed black man who wrote his own autobiography, one of the earliest known books by a formerly enslaved person. Susi, I'd love to welcome you back to the show, and we can learn more about the work that you do and your family's story. Thank you, Susi, for your time.
Well, thank you.
Again, this is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're going to learn more about how the Witness Stones Project is happening in communities across our state. You can also ask a question, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been talking about the Witness Stones Project with Dennis Culleton, co-founder and executive director of the Witness Stones Project. And Bill Sullivan is here, Suffield Historical Society trustee. There are efforts to place a witness stone in the town of Suffield through the work of Bill and a community study group. So, Bill, we've learned about your research. We've learned a little bit about Tamer. Where are you in the process to actually place a stone in town to remember her?
I have gone in front of the Board of Selectmen twice, and they've been great meetings. And actually, before that, I presented to the Veterans Group. It happens that the location of Luther Loomis's mansion is right on the corner of our two busy streets, Bridge Street and North Main Street. And that, over the last 20 years, has evolved into a wonderful Veterans Park. And so the class first proposed a installation of her memorial, Witness Stone Memorial, just inside the sidewalk, inside their park, but they were concerned about that, the Veterans Group and the Board of Selectmen. So we're working on alternative locations, and we're in the process of that. So it's been two good dialogues, and we're scheduled to have another dialogue to hopefully finalize the best location for the Witness Stone.
You mentioned they were concerned with the suggestion to place this near the Veterans Park. Why is that?
I think they feel that with this, the Veterans Park being a sacralized place right now, if we allow a memorial like this that's not related to memorializing people of service and their sacrifice, that it's a slippery slope that another memorial might go in or some other type of thing. And that's where, it's interesting. It's an important point to consider. But it's interesting too, but this is the part where this is hard history. And, as Susi's saying, African American history is American history. And so, in some respects too, we're coming to these groups, and they haven't had some of our, the Suffield Historical Society adult online class. We began with the Hard History podcast, and so that people could learn how to see history and answering other questions like, so how do you begin this history? You have to look at, well, who was involved in supplying all of the raw materials so that slave plantations in the Caribbean could, exist and produce sugar. And it's really the mid-Atlantic states and the New England states did that. That's the triangle that was missing in our U.S. history books the last 20, 30 years. And that this is how you begin to do the detective work. So it's sort of like the first 10 minutes of your hour-long detective series. And then you trace those economic factors, and then you find the enslavers that way. And so all this information is complex, and it's coming at a big wave. And so every dialogue I've had with the Board of Selectmen meetings, I think, have been fascinating, because we're learning where each of us stand with this position, and we're learning from each other and continuing the dialogue.
Dennis Culleton, I wanted you to respond because, again, so much research and passion goes into some of what these communities are doing. And when you get to the point where it comes time to now place the witness stone to acknowledge this person, this enslaved person that lived in one of our Connecticut towns, it's not so simple as to find a place that everyone in the community can agree on.
Yes, and one of the things that Bill is touching on is, we don't want to do the Witness Stones project to somebody. We don't want to do it to a community. We want to do it with a community, and that's why it's so important that the community is involved. We heard, members of our class and the local historians, and so it becomes a big part of it because it is a process and we have to go through it, and not everybody is on the same place on the path. In Guilford, we've installed so far 7 Witness Stones memorials, and we had one community member who mostly we're putting them in public places, but we are also putting them in front of private homes. And we had a community member who said, I prefer not to have it in front of my home. And we respected that. And we're hoping, down the line that they'll come around and say, well, that would be great because it's a really good story to tell at that place. But we have to respect that not everybody's at the same place. And the worst thing we could do is force it on someone who isn't ready or a community that's not ready. So that's why, somebody says, well, Dennis, how do you market the Witness Stones project? I said, I have to wait for people to ask. People have to ask, invite us into their community, because if we put this on someone, then that's just going to cause resentment. And I think we'll all get there. I think everybody will get to the point of saying, this is important work and we need to highlight it. And sometimes it's about finding the right spot. In Guilford, the first stone we put in was in front of the town hall with the full blessing of the Board of Selectmen. And that's where Moses lived 2 buildings before. So we put the first stone in for Moses in front of the town hall in Guilford, and we were embraced by the community. The second stone we put it in was in front of the savings bank, and they embraced it. So, but that's not going to happen all the time. So we have to, in some communities, we find the partner. In Norfolk, the story we did, the project we did with James Mars. James Mars was a deacon, and he was also enslaved by a member of the Congregational Church there. So the first stone was put in by the on the grounds of the Congregational Church with their blessing, support, and everything else. So, we work with communities. We're not here to tell people what to do. We're just here to, help tell these stories.
It's also interesting to note, like all good teachers, this is just good common practice. You meet your students where they are. And the Board of Selectmen are very positive to the idea of a Witness Stone installation. And they're just trying to figure out, how the veterans feel, what would be appropriate. So that's why I bring up the word dialogue again. We're having this dialogue right now. And yeah, so it is exciting that they all see how we're joining, really this movement. When you just, even the statistics you just mentioned of the Witness Stone project, it's quite exciting to be a part of it.
We just have a couple of minutes left. You just heard Bill Sullivan, who's a trustee with the Suffield Historical Society, leading efforts in the town of Suffield to place a witness stone to memorialize Tamer, a woman who was enslaved in the late 1700s. Dennis Culleton is also here, co-founder and executive director of the Witness Stones Project. Dennis, can you talk about what it's like to install these stones and the ceremonies that you've been part of?
Yes, it's amazing to me, and I think sometimes you think that maybe we'll do this and we hope something happens. It's kind of like it's kind of like cooking. You have all the ingredients, the temperatures are, but I'll say the second year we had the Witness Stone ceremony here in Guilford, Connecticut. We invited former state representative Pat Wilson-Phineas to come down and be our keynote speaker. And she is the 9th generation descendant of Montrose and Phyllis, who were purchased in Boston in 1727. And she spoke to the community about what this project meant to her, very, very similar to what Susi was saying, how important it is to know your history. and how blessed she felt by knowing that, and the audience was in tears. And it was just so amazing. And then later on, we have this photograph of Pat and one of our students putting the stone in the ground in front of the savings bank, and for her sixth generation great grandfather Montrose. And I don't think it could have been more powerful, because we had the story of Montrose, but then we had his sixth generation great granddaughter as a personification of all the sacrifices he made. He was able to gain his freedom and have property, and that property was an inheritance to his children and grandchildren. And then we followed this family all the way to the present. I think there's some 13-year-olds in Seattle, but it is just an amazing story. And there's so many of them. And that's the part. There's so many stories, and you couldn't feel more moved than what happened on that day. But then May 1st, we're in Norfolk, and people walked away with the same feeling, telling the story of James Mars working with the students at Salisbury School. And this is happening across the state over the next few weeks. And it really feels, Bill said, we call it a project, but it's beginning to feel like a movement, I guess.
Well, it's been a really interesting hour to learn more about how this movement is spreading. Dennis Culleton, co-founder and executive director of the Witness Stones Project. Thank you, and thank you for your work doing this around our state.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you for having me on board. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of good leads and good questions from the community because your show is so popular, and the people who listen to it are people who really oftentimes want to make a difference in their community. So thank you so much for contacting me and getting me involved with the show.
Thank you, Dennis. We love all our listeners, lifelong learners. And I also want to thank Bill Sullivan, a trustee at the Suffield Historical Society. Bill, I can't wait to hear what's next for this potential stone for Tamer and all the work that you and community members have been doing. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Lucy.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Tess Terrible produced today's show. Kat Pastor is our technical producer. And Hannes Brown composed our theme song. We hope you have a great weekend.